We're going to get started. My name is Christina Sloop. I am the Department of Fish and Wildlife Science advisor, as well as the lead of the Science Institute. And I just want to recognize and thank Whitney Albright for organizing and coordinating yet another very interesting talk. And before I have the honor of introducing our speaker today, I want to go through a little bit of housekeeping first. So first off, we want to make sure that you're aware that we have a wonderful talk coming up in October on the 9th, same time, 1 to 3 p.m. here in the auditorium of the Natural Resources Building. The author of the talk is Arthur Middleton, and the title is The Ecology and Conservation of Ungulate Migrations in the American West, which is a really important and interesting view of connectivity of large mammals that you don't want to miss. So put it on your calendar if you haven't done so already. So please save the date. We will post additional details and registration links soon to the Conservation Lecture Series website. And for those of you that are working for the department, it will be made available in Learn as usual. So today's presentation will be followed by a Q&A period. So think of questions as Lisa presents. And then we'll do that at the end of the talk. And folks on the phone, you are muted throughout the call to preserve the sound quality. But if you have questions, please type your questions into the chat box. And then we will relay them to the speaker at the end. And then finally, the presentation is being recorded. And we will make it available on the Conservation Lecture Series website afterwards, as usual. All right, so without further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. Lisa Micheli. She is the president and CEO of the Pepperwood Foundation in the North Bay, Santa Rosa area. And I'm pleased to welcome my long-term colleague and friend. And I'm so excited to have her come to speak to us today. So I want to just give you a little bit of an overview of where Lisa has been, and I don't know, Dr. Micheli, I guess I'm not used to calling you that, but that's what she is. So Dr. Micheli joined the Sonoma County's Pepperwood Foundation in October of 2009 as its inaugural executive director, and now serves as the organization's president and CEO. She brings more than 30 years applying her technical, policy, and fundraising expertise to the design and implementation of ecological restoration, research, and education programs. She started her career at the US EPA and then completed her graduate studies at UC Berkeley's Energy and Resources Group as a NASA Earth System Research Fellow in 2000. She now focuses her research on relationships between climate, fire, watershed health, and biodiversity, and has published numerous peer-reviewed studies on river restoration, climate adaptation, and community-based approaches to biodiversity conservation. Dr. Micheli serves as the co-chair of Pepperwood's Terrestrial Biodiversity Climate Change Collaborative, also known as TBC3, a director of the Rebuild North Bay Foundation, and as a science advisor to the Sempervirens Fund, the Chile, California Conservation Network, the Bay Area Open Space Council, and the Water Research Foundation. So please welcome Lisa, and I will.
Thank you, Christina. Thanks for everyone who came here today to participate in this talk, and thank you everyone who's listening on the phone. I know you're out there, and I look forward to hearing your questions. Today I have the honor of really summarizing the work of a number of people on my team who are listed here. And I think there's one slide in this deck that I'm actually an expert on. I'm looking forward to that one. So I'm going to do my best to represent just the incredible cross-discipline work that's happening on the preserve and talk a little bit about applications, we think, to long-term resiliency of both our human communities and our natural world. So I'm going to go over a little bit about what Pepperwood is, and if you're new to us, what are some of the key science questions that we felt we had an opportunity to move on after getting impacted by the fire, and just showing you some of the observations from the field that we're looking at. There is a ton of data that we've collected and have yet to fully analyze, so I'm very open to ideas that people may have today about where we should take our research. And then some more discussion about the very practical challenges facing us in terms of restoring a landscape that has been burned, and how we're working with our community to share lessons learned through this process. And then finally, what do we think the opportunities are to scale up? We're coming from a very highly resourced area. We have incredible collaborators where we're working. We're working at multiple county scales, crossing county lines, and we think that we have the opportunity to help inform California's strategies and strategies for the West from this sub-regional kind of view. So Pepperwood is a leader working on solutions for land, water, and wildlife, and we do this in a very collaborative framework. We are incredibly lucky that two local philanthropists in the North Bay, Herb and Jane Dwight, gifted the community with a 3,200 acre research reserve that had originally been given to the California Academy of Sciences, and now the Dwight Center for Conservation Science, which opened in 2010. We're about to celebrate our 10-year anniversary. And you can see where we're located. We're up in the Miacamas Range at the Inner Coast Range, basically the mountains in between Calistoga and Santa Rosa. And our mission is advancing science-based conservation. And we do that, as I said, through a lot of different collaborations where we help serve as the science team for local land trusts, local park districts, water districts, municipal agencies, state agencies, and we also serve as the climate advisors to the Bureau of Land Management office in Ukiah. So we work all the way from Santa Cruz Mountains up to the Oregon border and over to the Blue Ridge Berryessa National Monument. We were very lucky in 2009 when I first arrived at Pepperwood as the first executive director to have the opportunity to host a group called the Terrestrial Biodiversity Climate Change Collaborative. And this was a dream opportunity with my co-chair, David Ackerley, to recruit scientists from the earth sciences, climatology, hydrology, near-surface meteorology, geospatial analysis, all kinds of ecologists, vegetation ecologists, and wildlife ecologists, and to come up with a cross-disciplinary strategy to evaluate the potential impacts of climate change on Bay Area protected areas. Our client to start with was the Conservation Lands Network of the Bay Area Open Space Council, and asking the question, what are the impacts that these lands are likely to experience, and how should it influence our acquisition and stewardship strategies? And perhaps what we learned in the process was also, how do our open spaces provide resilience for adjacent communities, particularly in landscapes where we have close proximity of urban areas and growing suburban areas and wildland working lands. And the result of that collaboration was understanding that despite the potential variability in future rainfall, given the climate trajectory we're on, under all future scenarios, we're looking at a more arid landscape and more likely a more fire-prone landscape. So the question that we ask at Pepperwood and as a team at TBC3 is, how will this shifting climate impact patterns of life in the landscape and also patterns of water? How might those patterns change over time? And then in turn, how do we make our ecosystems, our watersheds, and our communities more resilient? We like to call Pepperwood a living laboratory. Here is a view of the preserve in all its glory last spring. And I love this terminology that came from Paul Hawken and Drawdown. We measure things, we map things, we model things, and then we test solutions for climate and fire resilience. And that makes us a little different from a typical field station in that, in addition to collecting long-term climate and biodiversity indicators, we are also actively managing and conducting ecological restoration experiments on the preserve that our scientific team has been deeply engaged in evaluating. I like to call Pepperwood a sentinel site. We borrowed this language from the NOAA program, which is largely focused on sea level rise at the different national estuarine reserves. But we're really trying to track the physical drivers of changes in climate and water and how the plants and the wildlife respond. And of course, we're in a very topographically complex environment, a lot of diverse geology as well. So we're looking at the intersections of the physical and the natural world. And we've been taking measurements since 2010 when we first installed our first research grade weather station. This is a map of the preserve showing you the distribution of vegetation types, grasslands in yellow, different forest types in blue and green, and giving you a sense of the density of the different sensor arrays that we have out on the preserve, ranging from weather stations, soil moisture probes, grassland monitoring sites, woody vegetation plots, bird monitoring sites, and wildlife picture index sites. And these are monitored on a regular basis to create a long-term record. And what we like to ask ourselves about our priorities here is, what will the ecologist of 2100 wish we were measuring right now to understand this period of rapid change? We worked with Max Moritz's lab as part of the TPC3 collaborative back in 2012. Meg Krawchuk and Max had developed a model that linked fire probability to climate. That work has been continued by Michael Mann at George Washington University, who's a TPC3 collaborator now, and has become the model of record linking climate change to fire probability as the model of record for CAL FIRE at this point. So we published these projections in 2016, showing in the dark red most of the areas that were impacted by the 2017 Northern Complex fire. So I have to say, serving as a local science institute, when these fires hit us in 2017, the community really reached out to us to help interpret the events that happened, help understand how to manage their property, and now also thinking about rebuilding and long-term resilience strategies. But it was an event that completely, I would say, basically caught us off guard. We were tuned in from the 2015 fire season in Lake County. We had assisted with a lot of technical workshops in the wake of those fires. But I think when an extreme event like this hits you, you're never really 100% prepared, no matter how knowledgeable you are about the risk. 95% of the reserve burned. This is a picture that was taken by one of our neighbors during the ground fire component of the fire event. This is a picture taken by one of our wildlife cameras when the fire was moving through during the ember-driven phase. And so the fact that we had all that instrumentation out there meant that we captured a lot of data about how the fire actually moved through the landscape. And anecdotally, I'll just say, when the 2015 fire hit, one of the things you don't know that you're going to be really interested in is your insurance coverage. And I had called my insurance agent to say, if a fire comes to Pepperwood, do I need to retrieve all my instruments? And she said, no, they're covered on your policy. And I was like, great. So we let them burn. And what they did was track the behavior, as I said, over the preserve. We'll talk more about how the fire moved through. But because of all those sensors, we were able to tell when and where the fire was actually on the ground. Our property is shown with a green star here, the proximate location. We are in what's now well characterized as a fire corridor. The Mark West watershed is perfectly oriented to capture Diablo winds and concentrate them. And this means that during the historical fire seasons over the last 100 plus 30 years, we've now shown with our historical ecologists that this is a place that fires happen repeatedly. So the red line is the Henley fire outline that burned most of the preserve in 1964. And with Arthur Dawson and Chuck Strickland, two historical ecologists in our area, they went back and found records of the same corridor burning in 1923 as well as 1871. The big difference in our recent experience was that the Hanley fire took about 3 days to move from Calistoga to Santa Rosa. 2017 took 3 hours. There were 100 structures in the way of the fire. In 1964, we lost 8,000. In 17, and again, there were no lives lost in that earlier fire, but just in the Tubbs footprint alone, we lost 22 people, including staff, families. So, yeah, it's an emotional thing. We also lost most of our wooden structures. The lower picture is our barn and our barn office. And then you're seeing things like our water tanks and our scientific equipment. So we are in the process of replacing almost everything. Our scientific equipment is almost all back in its spots with some augmentations and actually improved communication. So that's the silver lining for us. And we just broke ground on the barn site last Tuesday. So the key science questions, and I have to say, you have a sense of how, what an interruption it was in our lives, and yet the entire Pepperwood science team was motivated right after the fire to start collecting data. We were very aware that this was an unprecedented opportunity because most of the fire research that's been done in California is concentrated in Southern California or the Sierras. So working with colleagues like Scott Stevens, we really realized this is one of our first opportunities to just even measure the impact of fire in our mixed montane hardwood ecosystem. So we were interested in how do you measure the intensity of burn and how do you make sense of the different products that come out about burn intensity. How does that intensity of burn then in turn affect ecological recovery and response trajectories? We were actively thinning our fuels with CAL FIRE. We were removing Douglas fir, young saplings that were invading our oak woodlands, and we were also introducing prescribed fire. So how did that influence the effect of the fire and trajectories of recovery? Right now we're doing some very exciting work with Alan and Lori Flint, who are here, and Max Moritz, measuring live fuel moisture and realizing that there's a direct correlation with soil moisture, which is something that's a lot easier to measure and model. So how can we use that to better estimate hazard conditions? And then finally, how can you bring all this data together to have a much more robust data set to inform both long-term strategies for forest management, but also to be able to better inform risk tools like red flag days in a much more spatially explicit way, and perhaps even ultimately fire behavior when a fire does break out. So I'm going to get into some of the post-fire observations. Again, this is the tip of the iceberg, but we want to give you a sense of the different kinds of data we're collecting and what we're seeing out in the field. This is an image of our Dwight Center, approximately 1 month after the fire, after the first rain. So you can just see how rapidly the grasslands have responded. And also what this picture is showing you is the mosaic of impacts on the landscape. On the right-hand side of this picture, you can see one of the most intensely burned areas. That's where we had the highest mortality, particularly among Doug fir. But if you look on the left side of that knoll that was in the lee of the wind-driven event, there's still a lot of large Doug fir that are standing. The darker areas directly behind the building are former chaparral areas, and those areas pretty much vaporized. Right? And you can see that in the foreground as well. And then most of the intermediate sized canopy items are oaks that are totally scorched and yellow and still kind of hanging out there. One of the first products that you get when you're in a fire impacted zone is the Watershed Emergency Response Team product that comes out of the state. Hugely helpful to put impacts in perspective. Also, when they publish this, they disclose that the main focus is on hazards. So this is basically a hazard map to try to locate locations that will be the most vulnerable to subsequent erosion and sedimentation after the fire. I will point out the red spots that you're seeing correlate with most of the burn intensity maps. That's where there were houses. So the most intense burns happen where there are structures. Structures have a lot more fuel per unit area than trees. We then rapidly were working with our partners at Sonoma State. Matt Clark is a remote sensing specialist who's done a lot of field testing of different remote innovative products at Pepperwood. And here you're looking at the relative burn ratio, and this is the difference in basically the greenness of the land before and after. So this is more geared towards ecological assessments, and it's a reproducible approach that we can use. And then we found it was really important. I've mentioned the wind-driven event versus the ground-driven fire. And I think that that's one area where we felt it was a meaningful distinction between the blue area, which is mostly what burnt in those first 3 hours via ember spread and winds that were gusting over 100 miles per hour, versus the orange part of the preserve, which is where the fire moved over the next couple weeks. And in fact, the preserve was on fire for at least a month. But that was a more slowly spreading fire and would have been much more akin to the anthropogenic and indigenous fire, which the ecosystem had evolved with. The other indicator we have of fire intensity is actually canopy damage. So this is a map comparing the extent of canopy damage based on a pre-fire LiDAR data set that was very high resolution and used for our vegetation mapping efforts, and a post-fire PHODAR data set. So we did not get all the laser altimetry data, but we had very high resolution photogrammetry. We were able to map where the fire got up into the canopy, and I'll come back to this data layer in a little bit. And then the field campaign. So the woman on our right is Micheli Halber. She's our preserve ecologist. She's an amazing field botanist. Actually did her PhD in part with Christina Sloop on her committee. And Micheli rapidly did a lit review to try to look for the very best ecological indicators we could use in the field. One of the things we learned is that you go to a published protocol, again, based primarily on conifers in the Sierras most likely, and we needed to adapt. We needed to adapt it somewhat. But Micheli was able to review the literature, come up with her own protocol, and then we actually held a number of trainings with Sonoma State and other state parks, regional parks, and Audubon Canyon Ranch, so that all of the big open space managers would be using a comparable method in the field. And you can see the indicators there. We're really getting at what were the indicators on the ground, what were the indicators on the tree, what was the estimate standing on the ground looking up of the amount of scorch, etc. Here's the one slide I know a little bit about. We also paired up immediately with the U.S. Geologic Survey, and we were in the rare situation where, as part of our rangeland monitoring, we had pre-fire infiltration measurements. So we are doing pre and post-fire infiltration. We're measuring those monthly for the last 2 years, and understanding what the recovery time of this landscape looks like. There was a lot of fear about debris flows and landslides immediately following the fire. The first year, we had a very low rainfall year, which we all sort of breathed a sigh of relief about, also because we had 8,000 toxic waste sites where the homes had been that we were trying to clean up. The upper right-hand side shows you a flood warning gauge, a rain gauge for floods that we host now with the Sonoma County Water Agency. And this system is on a very resilient communication system that allows us now to pipe all of our weather data, our 17 soil moisture probes and weather stations, back to the Water Agency and to then other partner agencies. I will say the preliminary data, and Thursday we're having the work team back up. And so this is a great example of how a field station can collect data that then can help improve the state products. And we are sensing that our data is showing that our landscape is not as prone to flash flooding as the data sets that were used for our work. So in some ways there was an overestimate perhaps of hazards. Of course, you'd probably rather err on that direction, but we're getting a much better sense of the hydrological response of our soils post-fire. So we really have 4 different categories of ecological response and recovery monitoring. As I mentioned, we have 30 plus grassland sites, linear transects that are evaluated every year. We now have 7 long-term exposures, and that data set is almost 9 years long. We did not have long-term monitoring in our chaparrals, except for a phenology transect. And so we've established those with nomad ecology, and we're actually the first California phenology monitoring site that has been burned. So I'm really grateful that our citizen scientists stepped up and have reestablished that site and are help advising the National Phenology Network on how to think about post-fire sites in their long-term data collection. In the forest, we have 54 plots that are managed by the Ackerley Lab. Those plots were installed in 2013 to capture climate change impacts, and every single plant above your knee and bigger than your pinky have been inventoried in those sites, and their sites plus our sites total over 6,000 individual trees that are being monitored. We supplemented our long-term sites with some targeted assessments of where we've been doing thinning and where we weren't. I'll give you a little bit of results from that today. And we're looking through the lens of fuels at a lot of these sites. So looking not just at the ecological response, but the density of fuels. We did just secure a CAL FIRE grant with Sonoma State to use ground-based LIDAR as well as air-based LIDAR to complement the demographic studies to look at fuel recovery. And then finally, I'll just give you a little teaser about our wildlife camera data and the breeding bird results that we have that we do using point blue methodologies. So a little bit about the response. What does the landscape look like right after you've been hit by a fire? Well, this is what it looks like 2 days after a fire. It's still smoldering. The wildlife is back. That's one of the first questions, actually, that the average layperson asks me is what happened to the wildlife and are they okay? So just for Fish and Wildlife people, just to know how important your job is to the public. And we did see animals come back right away, but we'll talk a little bit about the longer term response. So 2 weeks post-fire, I mentioned upon the first rainfall, the grasslands started coming back right away. You saw that green peach fuzz in the aerial photo. 3 weeks post-fire, oaks blooming out, okay? So you saw sort of the picture of the scorched oaks. They started pushing out green leaves very early on. There are not many dead oaks at Pepperwood. And then stump sprouting, 6 to 8 weeks post-fire, you start to get these beautiful little tiaras of resprouting. And you know, as we brought people back onto the preserve, educating people that this organism is still alive and that this organism is adapted, especially in chaparral habitats, to get totally torched and look a little frightening, but the organism's there, it's going to come back. So this gives you a sense of some of the time series we have for our photo points that are also linked to transects. And part of the message of the story is how swiftly our grasslands came back and what a different timeline the forest trajectories basically are on in terms of the understory response. Perhaps not surprisingly, our grasslands had a lot less thatch after the fire. I will say it was a little bit of an arm wrestling between myself and the preserve manager. We have 125 head of cattle who conduct our conservation grazing program. They're our collaborators, our grazer collaborators. One of the biggest challenges when we were still evacuated was getting hay in for those cattle. They actually survived by standing in the middle of our 20-acre prescribed burn site. And so cattle are smarter than you might think. We had to take them off site because we didn't have any forage, as you could see. But by April and May of that spring, it was the biggest productivity year we'd ever seen at Pepperwood, which is showing there. And so I'm really glad we did decide to bring the cattle back. But Michelle's point about her grassland results are that within about a year, she had most of the biomass back, and the species composition did not seem to shift majorly as a result of the fire. And this just gives you a sense. This is looking down in the summer of 2018 at one of our exposures, and just to understand for scale that that exclosure of the grass is pretty much over my head, at least up to my shoulder. So it was a big grassland year. The rest of the area has been grazed in that shot. And then looking at stump sprouting, just basic information about what sprouts out, what doesn't. And this is comparing an a January 2018 survey and an August 2018 survey. And there were a lot of things that hadn't started sprouting in January that you really needed to come back and see in the late summer season. And there were some things sprouting that hadn't necessarily been that dominant before. Let's see what the other notes are. Basically, the red oak and the tan oak were the most rapid in terms of responding, but the big leaf maple, black oak, and blue oak came up later and were much less productive. And then we're looking at the seedlings. So I mentioned that the 54 accurately plots were really installed to look at the difference of the impact of topoclimatic location, looking at the variability between relatively dry or wetter sites on species composition, but then also to be set up to capture changes in species composition over time, with the theory being that theoretically there would be more drought tolerant, more arid. Nomad ecology, we set up structured long-term plots that we'll continue to look at over time. And here's our beautiful redwood lily on the right-hand side, which we did have at Pepperwood, but it was quite, well, it had been recorded at Pepperwood and the 64 fire. We hadn't seen it since then. And then we have a blooming bear grass. Understory diversity. I think there's an interesting story here because people were also very excited to see how native plants and rare plants respond in the understory, and we definitely saw a lot more diversity in the first year, along with a lot more bare ground. But the second year, the weeds took off. And just to give you a sense of what that looks like, this are the thistles in some of our understory sites where we're doing field work now. And there's certainly carpets of broom like this in our area as well. So I think it's a point well taken that the fire is fostering biodiversity, but it's also then exacerbating and creating openings for some of our invasive weeds. It's pretty overwhelming. And then in terms of our wildlife, just have a couple examples. The lazuli bunting definitely seemed to go up, and this was true in the area. A lot of bird watchers were seeing more of them. They seemed to like the fires. And interestingly, we saw more porcupine observations after the fire, and we're starting to try to understand what that's about. Another point that Michelle really wants to bring home is there are trees that sprouted out right after the fire, a lot of epicormic sprouting and other kind of sprouting, and you were like, hooray, they're going to survive. Well, not all those trees are going to make it. And that's why we're continuing to look. I mean, we have a whole bunch of trees that we're not sure whether they're going to make it, and we need to look next year and the year after. So that's probably the most common question we get asked by our neighbors is, when do you know if a tree is safe to take down or if it's going to come back? And unfortunately, our answer is kind of a wait and see kind of answer. But certainly there are some that we thought were going to make it that are not. Okay, so that gives you a sense of some of the things we're seeing on the preserve in the area that burnt. And now I'm going to talk a little bit more about the practical side of managing this reserve and work that we're doing now in partnership with CDFW through the Prop 1 and 68 program. First thing is public safety. We're an educational hub. We had to survey the entire preserve for hazard trees. Hazard trees are a problem for at least 4 years in a landscape like ours. And we decided that we definitely needed to clear certain areas that had high educational traffic. So we have taken down hazard trees along roads and some of our most used trails. The rest of the preserve is basically off limits unless you're a researcher and you get a safety training and you're willing to go out there with a hard hat. So we've been pretty serious about that, but this, as you can imagine, was a pretty big land management challenge to actually clear 25 miles of roads and 3 miles of trails. On the site that was next to one of our most traffic trails, and a site where we were pretty convinced that we had had a Doug fir invasion episode that had shaded out the understory of oaks, we have gone in and taken out all the big Doug fir. To leave them standing would have kept us in a hazard situation for years to come, and these were saleable logs, so we took them out and were able to pay for the job as a result of it. And now we're actively restoring this site, erosion control and planting and invasive weed control with our volunteers, and as well as prescribed burning. And this just gives you a sense of what our Doug fir thinning program looks like. Left-hand side is a thin site. The right-hand side is a site that hasn't been thinned, and that green stuff is all baby Doug fir coming up as ladder fuels. This is what a ladder fuels treatment site looked like for us. The recommended forest practice is lop and scatter, so you bring down those Doug firs. You can see what we were taking down the back. They're a little bit bigger than the previous picture. And then you put them on the ground and wait for them to decompose. Well, that takes a while. And in our case, we had sites like this that had only been cleared a few years beforehand, so what you had was a very dry layer of fuel carpeting the floor. And this is what those sites look like now. So we feel like we're observing indicators of pretty high intensity burning on the ground. There is the upside that there's not dead standing Doug firs left as a result. But we are now taking this kind of treatment to the next step, where we actually create piles for burning, and we burn them and then get the carbon into the ground. To the extent we can, we're trying to burn those slowly, so it's more of a biochar product, and we're actually sequestering some carbon. But this means that as a result of our learning from this fire, it's actually, we're doing another step in terms of our fuel thinning processes. And this is an example where the fire came through and cleared everything to where that big tree is, but beyond there, we have a bunch of dead standing baby trees. And frankly, we're not exactly sure what to do with these sites right now, but they certainly pose an ongoing fuel problem, and we'll probably try to get in there and treat some of those sites as well. So moving forward, we have a goal of thinning on the order of 100 acres a year of some of these Doug fir invasion sites. As I said, there's still plenty of Doug fir out there despite the fire coming through. We'll be continuing to restore that salvage logging site with more of an oak woodland type habitat mix, trying to get on those invasive species. In terms of the erosion, I will say we did not have any landslides or debris flows in the burned areas, but the flooding has certainly exacerbated erosion problems we already had, primarily associated with the roads. So we're continually working on those, as most people do. But what is the opportunity now with our Prop 1 and 68 grant funding is actually to very thoroughly evaluate these different treatments. I should mention also our prescribed fire program, which we're continuing to pursue as a partnership with CAL FIRE. So we're really grateful for that funding. Thank you. And finally, where are we going? So I mentioned that we have our land and people come to the preserve to learn, but I think one of the most important functions we play is sitting on a lot of technical advisory committees for Sonoma County, for Lake County, Napa County, Mendocino County, partnering with the Sonoma County Forest Conservation Working Group, which is trying to serve private landowners. And in Sonoma County, 85% of the forest is privately held. So moving on stewardship and climate adaptation is really about engaging those private landowners. One thing that seemed like low-hanging fruit for us was to help contribute to better fuel data sets. The California FRAP system has a fuels layer. It's intended to characterize the entire state of California. When I asked our local CAL FIRE vegetation management team whether they utilize it for planning, they said not really, because it's not at a scale that works and it tends to be outdated. So they get in their trucks and drive around and look for problems. I said, well, I don't think we have time for that. So we wanted to leverage the investments that we'd made with NASA and LIDAR to come up with a lot better fuels maps. This is what a traditional fuel model looks like. This is using Scott and Bergen U.S. Forest Service techniques, where the density of the color gives you an indication of how much faster that will burn and how much higher the flames will be. And this is something that could be put into vegetation management plan. And then we're really excited about this product. This product actually is looking at sub-canopy conditions, and it's using the LIDAR data to look at between 1 and about 4 meters. And based on that density, estimating what the ladder fuel density looks like. And we use that the canopy damage map. And this term, the ladder fuels term, plus one of our climatic indicators, climatic water deficit, were the two best indicators of where the fire got up into the canopy. And as I mentioned, we're continuing to do the work, or really just starting to be a field site where we start to relate the live fuel moisture to soil fuel moisture to better inform fuel hazard maps. If you haven't played with the basin characterization model, especially if you're in the Bay Area, you can access the data through the TBC3 Watershed Analyst tool that's on the California Climate Commons. You can actually access all of the data and projections as well. But we're finding that this term, which really helped influence vegetation distribution models, better understanding where plants can grow, is also an important factor for looking at fire hazards. And we're working right now with a number of different partners to integrate these tools, in particular to increase access for private landowners, so we can start to support efforts. A lot of the efforts in our area now are to aggregate landowners into watershed groups or neighborhood groups and try to achieve economies of scale for needed treatments by providing technical assistance and regulatory compliance assistance. It's also terrific to show that a scientific research station has some very practical applications for the community. We're now hosting these 360-degree fire cameras, and we're the founding hub of the North Bay network of cameras. And this is now a network that allows CAL FIRE and our local fire agencies to scan the landscape when a fire gets called in, which usually happens faster than someone else seeing them through a camera. We zoom into that spot and they can assess exactly what's going on and what the response is that's needed. We also held with the California Fire Science Consortium in May of 2018 a Living with Fire symposium, and I just felt it was very important with all the confusion that's going in our community, that they get to learn from experts about the history of fire in our region, the future of fire, and what they could do about it. This website actually has all of those presentations recorded, and we're making it a resource available to fire safe councils and fire safe communities, where they can hear the CAL FIRE presentation on defensible space, home hardening, forest management, etc. There's also an awesome story map that our partners at Tuckman Geospatial made with the County of Sonoma. I really recommend checking this out if you want to get deeper into the science around this fire. And finally, we're working pretty hard right now to think about how to use the preserve and all the instrumentation we have to improve our situational awareness, to have a real-time data stream that can help inform flood, drought, fire warnings for our community. I mentioned the toolkit. This is something right now I showed a Sonoma County example that's being used for Sonoma County Veg Plan, but we actually have our sights set on expanding that approach to all the neighboring counties, particularly the 4-county efforts in Napa, Mendo, and Lake with Sonoma of the Rebuild North Bay Foundation. We're part of a team called Taking Action to Reduce Wildfire Hazards on that. And we also have interest to link with our friends at One Tam and the Golden Gate Biosphere Reserve to bring this approach all the way down to the Santa Cruz Mountains Conservation Network. I just want to put out there that when we got hit by the fires, we had an incredible opportunity to work from the Mayacamas to Berryessa ranges with all the land trusts, open space districts, and parks on a wildlife corridor strategy for climate adaptation. These folks are so into this project called the Mayacamas to Berryessa Landscape Connectivity Network that they continued to meet despite the fact that all of their agencies were impacted by these fires. And I feel now that we are realizing the potential of our wildlife corridor management and outreach work to also be a vehicle for not just talking about biodiversity and healthy watersheds, but also bringing ecologically sensitive forest management knowledge and technical assistance to people living in these corridors. So that's what I put together for the presentation. I'm happy to answer any questions. Or I should say I'm happy to do my best to answer any questions.
Okay, well, thank you, Lisa. That was very interesting. Are there any questions in the room? All right.
How about that ringtail cat? I might have to ask Morgan Gray to help me answer this question, but I believe we have had cameras in place for 10, 12 years, and how did we get to see that ringtail cat, Morgan?
I believe that cat was caught on camera at a neighboring preserve we monitor at Pepperwood and at Modini Mayacamas. It was caught at Modini Mayacamas, and I think it was just a blur. So we thought it might be a raccoon at first, and then looked more closely and it's a ringtail. But that was,
and that's like the most
month.
famous Facebook post of Pepperwood to date. Everywhere I go, like even my insurance agent's like, "Oh my gosh, that ringtail cat! Like I didn't even know we had. I didn't even know that existed." So it's pretty exciting. Yeah, you'll hear more about the cat.
Anyone else?
Quick question for you. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about your engagement with private landowners. I'm curious if after these wildfire events, if you found more people coming to you and kind of seeking your expertise and information, or if it's based on a lot of outreach that you do in the community.
Yeah, I mean, I can say we've been inundated by private landowners for support. So first of all, we host workshops on our own and with the Resource Conservation District and with the Forest Working Group. We held a number of hazard tree workshops, and they were just sold out within a day or two of opening them. And it was very touching because private landowners in our neighborhood who had lost their homes were so concerned about their trees and taking good care of them. What was the right thing to do for my forest? It's a little overwhelming because we get lots of individuals asking us to come to many, many meetings, and we come to as many as we can, and we're trying to make these other kinds of resources available, and we're trying to empower the resources that landowner serving organizations have. So for example, the Sonoma RCD had just recently gotten a forester, which is amazing. He's already completely booked. And Napa and Lake County are now going to be sharing a forester. So one of the biggest challenges is, you can sit down with someone, but ultimately they need a registered forest professional or some kind of veg management specialist to help them develop a plan. But as I said, we're trying to highlight opportunities for the communities we know to scale up their efforts, so that they're not doing it one parcel at a time. And those were meetings I was having here at CAL FIRE today too, about how much better it is for CAL FIRE if we can help boost the landowner coordination. So we're doing that as a collaborative effort. But we see it as absolutely critical to supporting adaptation in our area. Yeah. And also I think it helps that we're a landowner. Like when the landowners come to get advice from us, it's not theoretical. We understand how much it costs. So that helps. Yeah. Is there a question over here? Christina, do you think?
My question is, I know the recovery after Mount St. Helens happened in such a way that was different than it might have occurred because of the time of year and the time of day that the eruption occurred. Do you think that the time of year that the fire occurred had a big impact on how the landscape will recover?
Yes, I don't know really anything about volcanoes, but I think that fire season was the perfect storm. We're pretty convinced that even though we'd had a normal water year, that the trees were still deeply stressed by drought, that there might have been some recharging of the upper soil, but the deep soil probably wasn't fully recharged. So it was a perfect storm in that we had an extended drought-stressed trees, then a rainy year that grew all the pine fuels. And if you take a look at some of our fire models, they're often surprising to people because wetter years can have higher fire risks because of the productivity earlier in the year. And so this is so much a part of our Mediterranean landscape where we have these very end of dry season, super dry conditions. I just also have to say that the winds that night almost knocked me over on my walk when you feel what that feels like, and that's what it felt like before the Valley Fire as well. We're having these extreme wind events that aren't necessarily unprecedented, but they're probably getting, I think there's a climate change component to them where they're getting more extreme and more intense. But those have also often been a feature of the landscape. But yeah, I think that the rapidity that the fire moved is very much about the long-term condition we're in relative to drought, and then the very extreme, they call it a nighttime drying event, where we have those Diablo winds and the humidity just goes so low, and then you have fires up over 100 miles per hour. So I definitely think that shaped the whole thing. Yeah.
Hi, Tadashi Moody with CAL FIRE. So I had a couple of questions. The first one was if with your fuels management that you're doing, particularly the pile burning, flop and scatter, dealing with the post-treatment residual material, are there any alternative methods that you've investigated? Is there capacity in the region for utilizing biochar or having that material moved off-site as opposed to piling and burning it?
Yeah, this is like the core focus of our Taking Action initiative, is a regional question. I'm not sure we've asked ourselves the question of whether how much of preserve is accessible with the equipment needed to haul out material. We really think of ourselves as an example of more of a remote site where that's not such an option. And I think we're also really interested about the applications of those materials in situ to help get soil carbon and soil moisture holding capacity up. But it's not out of the question. We do have a biochar project in Sonoma County. Sonoma Water actually has I think it's called a pyrolyzer. And I think the challenge is making it economic. This is getting me into this realm of economics, which is not my specialty, but how do you make it economically viable for one of those operations to work? Or do we need like a green energy angel investor to come host some of the, basically fund some of the infrastructure so we could see whether or not it's economically viable. So we're very much open to biochar, biomass, other ways to use this material, and we're just starting to have that conversation. We have one mill in Cloverdale. It's only suitable for large logs. So I actually have a retired CAL FIRE and retired Weyerhaeuser guy. He spent half his career in both of those places coming to give us that kind of advice. And so I'd say the environmental community is getting out of its silos and starting to ask questions with industry about what can we really do, because I run an advisory council for Rebuild North Bay, and all the natural resource specialists agree it's primarily an economic constraint at this point. It's not a scientific knowledge constraint. It's how do we help the landowners? How do we make this more affordable for the landowners? Because it's very expensive, and not everybody can afford to do it. So, yeah.
My second question is about the LiDAR mapping and the ladder field mapping is of great interest, I think, to our group at FRAP. And I'm wondering what sort of resolution that you're mapping the LiDAR, is like a spatial resolution you're mapping that
the
ladder
fuel
fields
model
at?
itself is at 5 meters, and the LiDAR itself is at 6 inches. So it's very, very high resolution.
And does that go along with the Sonoma County vegetation mapping?
Yeah, so we took the data set that was used for the Sonoma County vegetation map and then reanalyzed it for some of these derivatives. And Mark Tuckman of Tuckman Geospatial is our lead analyst on that, and he was the analyst on the veg map. So it's been so great to have that continuity and local knowledge. But we were very excited the ladder fuel seemed to capture something meaningful. And again, I mean, now the county has a snapshot of these problem areas, and before it would have been your guys driving around in trucks looking for them, so that's why we're excited to scale it up. We're also partnering with Zalo AI, and they are trying to train their Landsat data on that data to figure out if there's other ways that we can get at it without having to use LiDAR. So that's an area of active interest for us as well.
And I'm very interested in that, what you mentioned briefly about the correlation between ground fire and like the mapped ladder fuels. Can you expand on that a little bit? Or
I can. I even have a slide in reserve for you. So this is what's exciting to me, is that we were able to do a multivariate analysis, and I should say we, Mark Tuckman, we. And this is the kind of work that we need to publish. It literally was finished about a week and a half ago. But these are some of the variables that we looked at, and getting relationships between these different variables. And so we looked at both the topography driven, this is just from the Nuns fire footprint, comparing the topographically driven fire from the wind driven. And the density of ladder fuels came up number 1 out of that multivariate analysis. Canopy height and canopy density are in there. And then water deficit came up in the top 4 for both of those. So we're really excited to share this with the FRAP group. We also should be publishing it because I think it's important to share. And we're really excited to make this available to the community, so we can learn. Yeah. I think that was a combination of MODIS satellite data, and I think we actually even tried to tap into some of the planet data. But for the specific methodology, I'll have to get you the write-up, yeah. But that was the satellite products over time. And then, of course, on our boundary, we could verify that with our sensors as well.
Okay, I have a question. So in terms of the community involvement, how did you go about including sort of the, by now probably well-known tribal knowledge around fire management? Was that a component, and are they involved? And if you have any
Glad you asked that question. So we're really lucky that we have a Native American Advisory Council. Our land is actually not within the boundary of a federated tribe. Our land was traditionally Wapo territory, and the Wapo alive or well, but they're not a federated tribe. Our council chair is Wapo Pomo and Wintoon, Clint McKay, and Clint is a co-author of our adaptive management plan. We have an entire chapter about restoration of traditional land stewardship techniques where appropriate. That site where I showed you the lop and scatter effect is a density of black oaks, and our council has decided they really want to focus on the black oak population on the preserve and how to manage it with traditional approaches. Our council understands that because, I mean, first of all, our council used to warn us about the time bomb that had been created by fire suppression. They would walk around and say, look at this understory. We can't even walk through it. This is not good. This is not good for wildlife. This is not good for the oaks. They have a different way of burning from CAL FIRE, and so it's interesting. And as our prescribed burning program goes forward, we want to bring those issues to the table and see if it's possible to do some of our prescribed burning using more traditional techniques. And we're probably going to try to pilot that around our black oaks. So I'd say the feedback from our council is it's not possible to go 100% back to where they were, but we are trying to reintroduce those as possible. And in particular, now that we have reduced fuels, if we can stay on top of it, can we start to use prescribed fire more routinely to get closer to the indigenous management techniques?
A question on the phone. Dave asks if you could speak a little bit more about the plan to prescribe burn. Will there be a public education plan, and will the public be allowed to attend?
Well, that's a great question. So when we started burning about 5 years ago, it did make our neighbors rather nervous. I think my second month at Pepperwood, we were having a lecture on dinosaur nostril bones and someone's car that wasn't kept in good repair spontaneously combusted in our parking lot. And it was the first time I dealt with fire in that landscape, and we had so many calls from the neighbors because they could smell the fire, they could see the fire, and that's when I learned that people kind of looked at our property as a hazard to their property. When we decided to start prescribed burning, we definitely had a public outreach effort with it. We reached out to everyone in our neighborhood to start with and held a couple information sessions. And we actually opened those sessions with our tribal chair because he talked to people about the history of fire in this landscape and how the Native American people used fire for these beneficial purposes to keep their villages safe from fire. And you would just see people's tension level going down as they absorb that information. So that was a great part of our public outreach. Then because we do all of our burns with CAL FIRE was there. We would show people the burn plan. We would show them where the breaks would be. We showed them where the trucks would be, and then people really calm down once they understand the logistics. It's really the unknown, I think, that scares people. And then we had people who were very skeptical coming in saying, why aren't you burning more, on the way out? So we continue to do that approach where we have an open house that lets everyone know what's going on. For safety reasons, it's hard to have these open to the public. They really have to be managed very carefully. And we don't necessarily know what day we're going to be able to burn. So when you're waiting to do a prescribed burn, you're waiting for the perfect day that the Air Resources Board will give you the green light and CAL FIRE will give you the green light. That site that I showed in the Black Oak area, we had prepared that for a burn. That's part of why that site was so well monitored. We waited a whole year, couldn't do it. And we're waiting again when the Tubbs fire burnt it, our non-prescribed burn, we call it. So it's harder to have observers, but we tend to have, there's a few students, et cetera, who can participate from a technical point of view, but we really have to restrict access during the burn time. But we document it very well so that we can share it with people as well.
Any other questions? Okay.
So for the prescribed burning, do you guys do any monitoring specifically related to the burns? Do you do any like pre-fire measurements and post-fire measurements and during fire?
Yep, all of our treatments, we do pre-fire surveys. during the fire, we're getting flame lengths and all those things. Again, we partner very closely with Scott Stevens' lab, and we generally have an alumni of that lab there coaching us. But I think at this point, you know, our team's pretty schooled in how to collect those measurements. And then post-fire, our grassland burn is very focused on medusa head control. And so we're really looking for the response in that population in particular. But yes, we do before, during, and after monitoring.
So this is all new work that came upon you unexpectedly. And you already had, I imagine, a full agenda of work to do as a foundation. So I'm just wondering how this becoming such a, well, what percentage of what you guys do does this represent, and what has it replaced, or how's it affected your organization, and what you're able to do that you did pre-fire?
Thanks for asking that question. It's very insightful. Well, I do tend to tell people that it's sort of like all of us have an extra day and a half a week of work. And somehow we're managing to do that. We were in the middle of a 5-year strategic plan when the fire hit us. And the guy helping me with that call and said, "How are you feeling?" I said, "Well, I'm not quite sure what to do with the 5-year plan." He said, "I think you need a 1-year plan right now." So that's what we did. Immediately post-fire, we kind of parked everything. I mean, first of all, we had to get back into our facility. We had to restore water. We had to restore power. We had to find housing for our displaced staff. We had to get, you know, take care of each other. Really, that's where it starts from. I mean, just the fact that I was able to go to my boss as an organization and say, "Can we guarantee that we can pay everyone?" You know, really basic stuff like that. Staff who are living on site, are we going to be able to pay for their stuff? So I would say in the first month, it was very like triage, logistics, people first. And then as we were able to get back on the property, just assessing what happened on the property, and then triage, as you saw, like we got to deal with public safety first, and then we'll move down the line. You know, all of us have some degree of post-traumatic stress, and you get in this adrenaline mode, especially when you're part of a community, which is, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? How are we going to respond? How are we going to prevent this from happening again? What, you know, fire season's coming again. So I'd say that from a psychological point of view, like personally, I just felt like, okay, I have to ground now. It's 2 years out. I mean, we're coming up on the 2-year anniversary, and we're going to host a resiliency summit. And it's almost like mind over matter that we have to ground. But from a facilities point of view, losing 3 major facilities, really 6 buildings total. I'm on the phone every week. I spend literally a day with insurance companies, with the design build team. Breaking ground was really a great milestone for us. And I have an incredible team supporting us. Our builder, for example, could be building for anyone. He's building for Pepperwood because his kids come on our field trips. So there's a lot of support, but I think, and then in terms of the scientific work, obviously we had to jump on the scientific work, but what I think is amazing about my team is we really haven't abandoned anything else, which is part of why supporting your team not to burn out and helping them manage their priorities. Lori and Alan O'Flint are here. Our soil moisture monitoring, we got back as soon as we could. Our fog monitoring got back as soon as we could. Our wildlife cameras went back out as soon as they could. And I guess what I would say is we are in a situation where we've collected a lot of data, and the backlog is going to be on the analysis. And as the person responsible for paying everyone's salaries, I need to be able to go raise funds to analyze this huge gold mine of data. And there wasn't a lot of money that came in for our scientific work. Mainly that's come from individual donations and family foundations. So we kind of went for it, doing all these things that weren't really funded out of the box. And now we're finding a home for them. But for me, you know, given that we were working on climate adaptation to start with, and we always saw fire as part of climate adaptation, that's what we're doing right now. We actually met with the USDA Climate Hub lead this morning. You know, how do we fold all this fire work back into the climate resilience initiative that we have? And I will say that we are restoring our momentum. Really, I'd say our big initiative that we were working on was the habitat corridors that I shared. And now it's like, yes, I think there was a pause in where we would have been without the fire. We might be further along with some of that implementation, but now it's even raised the stakes and given us another lens to look at the corridors through. So to me, I think if so much of our work right now is large landscape conservation, and in Mediterranean landscape, this is very important to think about how to incorporate fire into that and not necessarily seeing it as something separate. So, that answer. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you everyone for coming. Thank you, Lisa, and your team for this incredible work and for just, you know, really pushing things forward so that we can all learn from it. And I guess this is it for today. And please tune in again on the 9th of October. And yeah, thanks to Whitney again for pulling all these together, and have a good afternoon.
Thank you all for the opportunity.